If you're interested in exploring these topics further, learning and connecting with like-minded individuals, check out the 3 Patreon discussion groups available. Just visit theinfinitesparkofbeing.com and click the participate button. I also offer a free meditation group online every Sunday evening at 8 p.m. Eastern. Just go to any of my social media profiles for the link found in my link tree. There's no pressure to be on camera or to actively participate in any of these groups. Just come and listen and enjoy. Join an online spiritual community of everyday people committed to understanding the human experience more deeply through spiritual practices that we can apply to our everyday lives. Join us. Welcome to the Infinite Spark of Being podcast. My name is Keith Welsh, and today we're talking about something fascinating and unsettling. We're talking about egregors, the idea that collective thought, belief, and emotional energy can actually manifest into something in a very real way that extends beyond just the psychological and social. It's something that exists between an idea and an entity, a thing that feeds off of attention and devotion. And whether you realize it or not, you've probably been under the influence of an egregor before. So what we're going to get into is how this concept relates to spirituality, cults, Tibetan Buddhist thought forms, the Satanic Panic of the 1980s, and the collective fear during the COVID pandemic. We'll also talk about how political ideologies can function like an egregor and what that means for how we interact with modern movements and belief systems. So let's get into it. The concept of an egregor comes from Western esotericism, particularly in the occult traditions of the 19th and 20th centuries. The word itself, however, comes from the Greek egregoros, which creepily enough means watcher, or one who is awake. Like I said, fascinating and unsettling. So think of an egregor like this. It's what happens when a group of people pour their thoughts, emotions, and energy into a shared idea, and that idea takes on a life of its own. It no longer needs any one person to sustain it. It feeds off the group's beliefs, their devotion, and their rituals. Now, most modern occultists and philosophers suggest that egregors exist somewhere between an abstract idea and an autonomous spirit, kind of like a deity that wasn't born from the divine, but instead from human attention. So think about that for a second. What would be the qualities of an entity born from the attention of human beings? That's a thought exercise for you. Now, we've all noticed how some movements, whether they're political, religious, or cultural, feel like they have a will of their own, like they pull people into them. They create their own rules, their own morality, and even punish those who stray away from the ideas, right? That's an egregor. And I know you're thinking, how could an idea punish people or make up its own rules? Well, remember, everything, not just animals, flesh and bone, everything in this multiverse consumes something. It all feeds on something. In this case, it feeds on attention. So this concept of egregor, it's odd because we tend to think in terms of flesh and bones, animals, insects, this kind of thing. But if this is a bit of a stretch, try this. Why couldn't a collective idea produce, at the very least, a force, right? That force compels its adherents to create rules, to create morality, etc., right? It compels them. While as an entity, it might not explicitly say it. It might not be speaking into someone's ears the way we imagine an entity would say things. But everyone collectively begins to have the same thoughts. I mean, look, to some extent, everything becomes an egregor, right? So I guess you just kind of have to decide what kind of egregor you'd like to manifest, right? Like what kind of attention will it feed on? And we'll talk more about this later, but let's use what I consider COVID culture as an example of an egregore that certainly punished people. And I realize that I'm about to touch the third rail here, but here it goes. At the time, the lab leak theory was considered a conspiracy theory and racist, while now the FBI, the CIA, the Department of Energy, and various foreign governments believe that it was due to a lab leak. Well, during the COVID years, Brett Weinstein and his wife, Heather Haying, were both demonetized by YouTube for leaning toward and talking about the lab leak theory. The egregore punished them. And once they were demonetized, very few people would even talk to them. Now, why is that strange? Because they are both former evolutionary biology professors. Still evolutionary biologists, but they used to work as professors. Now, folks at YouTube demonetized 2 experts for speaking about something that was related to their field of expertise. However, others were allowed to stay monetized if they supported the stance that the lab leak was a conspiracy theory. And a lot of you, myself included, heard the lab leak idea and thought, this kind of seems plausible. Remember Jon Stewart on Stephen Colbert's show trying to bring it up, and then Stephen Colbert trying to stop him. This was the thing. Well, I guess, those of us, you guys probably, that had questions, you were afraid to ask those questions because you were going to be punished by this force. So what you saw during COVID was groupthink. We see the same phenomena with other social and political movements. The definition of groupthink, in case you're wondering, is the practice of thinking or making decisions as a group in a way that discourages creativity or individual responsibility. What we saw in those years, or with any of these social or political movements, is that there was or is a group of people deciding that you had now strayed from the message and said the wrong thing. Or maybe another way of looking at it is that you left the timeline. The egregore wanted us as a culture to go in a certain direction, so if you didn't have the same vision as the egregore, it compelled the adherents to remove the person from the group. And as I mentioned, citizens were often demonetized on YouTube, mocked or outright canceled or fired from their job for standing by ideas that were later found to be true. Now, you can remove the word COVID and replace it with any word. The point is, if you want to know if you're under the control of an egregore, ask yourself this: is creative thinking or expression allowed? Is individual responsibility accepted? Let me say that last thing again. Are you allowed to be responsible for yourself? Or is that discouraged for the sake of maintaining the group's ideology? And that takes us into one of the clearest places we see the phenomena of the egregore, and that's in cults. So, first of all, let's look at the definition of a cult. A cult is considered to be a system of religious veneration and devotion directed toward a particular figure or object. A relatively small group of people having religious beliefs or practices regarded by others as strange or sinister. Now, I'm not trying to be a contrarian, but I'm sure we can all hear the subjectivity in that definition. However, we've watched all the documentaries and understand that it gets much weirder than that, but it doesn't always start off weird. I mean, maybe it's just me, but I didn't have that big of a problem with Osho's cult other than that fucking Sheila lady that tried to give an entire town salmonella. The polyamory was weird, but I don't know. I mean, these things don't start off bad, right? I mean, Heaven's Gate wasn't completely insane until that lady died, and then it became just that weirdo Marshall Applewhite staring into a camera. I mean, I don't think what they were saying was any crazier than any other political or religious movement, but that's how the egregore works. Think of it as an entity that feeds on attention. The way we need nutrients, right, from food, it gets that from human attention. So at first the egregore is small, it's almost innocent, but then it grows. It needs more attention. It's not okay with a little attention. It needs a lot of attention. And like some booze-addled college student in a bar, it's not happy until everyone is looking at them. So when it comes to cults, look at Jonestown. In Jonestown, Jim Jones wasn't just a man anymore. The movement itself had become an entity, a force that drove people to do things they would never have considered in isolation. It dictated their morals, their fears, their sense of reality. The Jonestown community had formed a collective egregor, and it demanded their devotion and all of their attention, even to the point of mass suicide. Jim Jones was just the mouthpiece of the egregor. This is also why when a cult leader dies, the movement sometimes doesn't die with them. If the egregor is strong enough, it keeps feeding on the belief, even if the creator's gone. You can see that in good ways too. I don't want to make this all sound bad, because egregor isn't necessarily a bad thing. I mean, it can be. So just to be fair, we see it with certain swamis, certain lamas and rinpoches and priests. Just because they die, it doesn't mean that the lineage dies too. I mean, it might not be quite the same. It might go through a readjustment period, but it doesn't just go away. If you look at the Hare Krishna movement in the West, after Prabhupada died, it got really, really, really dark and unsavory, to say the least. There's actually a documentary about it on Peacock called Krishna's Gurus, Karma, and Murder, or something like that. It's about this guy, Swami Kirtanananda, who tried to take over the whole movement after Prabhupada died, and things got icky, as they do. Anyway, after Prabhupada died, there's this power vacuum. And the problem was that, darkness filled that vacuum. However, the egregor that Prabhupada gave birth to was also powerful enough to overpower the perversion and greed that tried to take it over. Now, I think one of the most interesting ways to attempt to understand the idea of the egregor is through the Tibetan Buddhist concept of the tulpa. This is another one of those moments where I get to chuckle at all of the scientific materialists that had this deep unconscious desire for spirituality, but then they thought they'd found this really nice workaround with Buddhism. But like I always say, the deeper you go, the weirder it gets. I really hope all of you very rational, scientific-minded people that are trying to hide from the mysticism of the world by studying Buddhism are ready for this. So I get such a kick out of this. Let me say this first. This is not a metaphor. This is not an allegory. This is exactly what I'm saying it is. A tulpa is essentially a mind-created entity. It's a being that is brought into existence through meditation and visualization. So Tibetan monks have long believed that through intense visualization and meditation, they could create these independent thought forms, entities that could even act outside of the creator's control. Again, would I say this was going to be creepy and unsettling? Why they do this is it's varied. A lot of times they make them and then dissolve them. Sometimes they put years into this practice, have this what amounts to an autonomous thought form energy ghost, and then they dissolve it. The point, as I understand it, like any other odd esoteric Buddhist practice, is to understand the illusory nature of the human incarnation. Sometimes they want assistance with something. Sometimes they want to understand themselves. So they create this thing. So there's your dose of, wow, Buddhism is a lot more mystical than the marketing team makes it out to be. So over time, Western occultists, these people, like I said, in the early 19th, 20th century, picked up on this idea and linked the idea of the tulpa to the egregor. Remember, in the late 19th century and early 20th century, Westerners were just learning about these shamanistic Eastern ideas. And for those of you self-hating Westerners plagued with white guilt, they were finding links between Eastern spiritual beliefs and Western spiritual beliefs. And that is an exciting thing when you find a commonality like that. Trauma responses, anxiety, ruminating thinking, grief and loss, stress, these are all reoccurring patterns in the mind. They're often the result of reacting the same way over and over again. Why do we do this? Because the mind believes the past is still here, happening now, causing the nervous system to respond accordingly. What the mind perceives, the body feels. Mind Transformation and Restructuring, MTR, offers a pathway to release these patterns. It guides both the mind and the nervous system out of these repetitive cycles and into a lighter, freer way of being. If this resonates with you, feel free to reach out via direct message or through the contact section at theinfinitesparkofbeing.com. You don't have to live the way you've been living. Change is possible. It actually brings you closer to your own belief when you see that what really seems like proof of a reality outside of the material world. You find these common things. It's like they just call a hat it's different than like a hat and a sombrero. It's the same word. I probably just exposed my lack of Spanish, but you get what I'm saying. And I only say that because so many people in the West act like there weren't spiritual systems in the West before the import of Eastern spirituality. There absolutely were. They were just secretive and required time and study to understand. And this is a problem when you have a populace that prefers to be spoon-fed everything from art to music to religion. So the difference is that a tulpa is usually an individual creation, while an egregor is born from a collective belief. However, both require the consumption of attention, which again is a scary thing to think about, right? So now that we understand tulpas and we're starting to understand egregors, think about mass hysteria. Think about moral panics. These are all examples of collective thought manifesting something real in the world. And again, this isn't always a bad thing. It's not just bad things that manifest as egregors. I really want to stress that fact. However, for our own safety and edification, we need to be aware of the danger of these things before we can use them positively. So let's look at one of the clearest examples of an egregor, the Satanic Panic of the 1980s. I remember this very clearly as a kid growing up in a Baptist school and church. It was front and center in the 1980s. So for those of you that don't remember or weren't around for it, this was a full-blown moral hysteria where people became convinced that satanic cults were secretly infiltrating daycares, churches, and schools to abuse children in elaborate satanic rituals. And for some of us that were maybe mistreated by the church staff, the irony of this statement is not lost. I hope it's not lost on you either. But it didn't matter that no hard evidence ever surfaced. The belief itself had gained so much momentum that it didn't need evidence. Think about that for a second. A belief that gains so much momentum that it doesn't need evidence to back it up. That's fucking weird. What you saw was that the collective fear became a living thing, an egregor that fed off paranoia, religious conservatism, and media sensationalism. Now, if you want to take a look at the most egregious case, look up the McMartin preschool trial. It all started with a freaky, weird, overbearing mother that had a fascination with her preschool-aged son's hindquarters. I'm sure there are plenty of YouTube documentaries out there for those of you that love true crime. But, it was real and it happened. Now, here's the eerie part. Once an egregor like this exists, it manipulates reality. People started remembering things that had never happened. They remembered things that didn't happen. The human mind is very susceptible to suggestion, and people, not just during the McMartin preschool catastrophe, but other situations similar to it, started producing false confessions and as well false testimonials. Again, I can't tell you that this was real. Please look it up. The McMartin witch hunt went on from 1983 to 1990. Think about that. It was one of the longest, most expensive trials in U.S. history. These children were coached and the adults bought it. And the worst part about the coaching is that the people doing the coaching didn't really know they were coaching these kids. Seriously, they were asking them leading questions because they wanted certain answers. Now think about this. They didn't think that they were asking leading questions. They thought they were being reasonable. But hey, here we are. It happened. And the kids obliged with stories that in the light of day made no fucking sense. One of the stories, my favorite one, was that the kids had been, this was the children after these weird leading questions. They said this to grown adults, and then the adults went, oh, well, geez. The kids' story was that they had been flushed down a giant toilet into a secret room to watch animal sacrifices. And in the United States, there were people that were able to vote and drive cars that believed it. And if they didn't believe it, they'd say something crazy like, well, the kids were drugged and maybe they didn't get flushed down a toilet, but they definitely saw animal sacrifices. Now, you tell me that there wasn't some other force at work here, that there wasn't an egregor involved. I mean, that's what mass hysteria is. The McMartin preschool trial is fucking crazy. So in the end, I believe that the Satanic Panic was a tulpa created by mass fear, an egregor, and it was sustained by paranoia and attention. Now let's talk about something much more recent. And here we go. The COVID pandemic. So I'm going to reach right over here and just give that third rail a little tap. I'm not going to talk about whether the virus was real or not. Obviously, COVID was real, but the collective thought form that formed around it, that's where the egregor comes in. People weren't just responding to the actual threat. They were responding to the idea of the threat, to the way it was framed, to the rituals and behaviors that became normalized overnight. It's no accident that masks, lockdowns, and distancing felt like these weird religious observances for some people. There was an orthodoxy about it, a belief that took on a life of its own to the point where questioning it in any way was met with fury and excommunication from the group, from society, the church of flattening the curve. And leaving or being excommunicated from the church of flattening the curve, was just like leaving any other cult or religious institution. You would lose access to money, family, and your job, just like Scientology. It even had a patron saint, Saint Fauci. I don't know if you've heard of him. He was known for encouraging the congregation to drop their ideological bullshit. I believe he was also famous for saying, I am science. So regardless of whether people were on one side or the other, the collective fear and doubt in institutions, needless to say, created an egregor, a mass entity that dictated behavior way beyond rational thought. And now here's the big one. I hope you're ready. Let's touch the third rail again. Political ideologies. These are some of the strongest egregors ever manifested. Now, this hits on something we discussed last week, but think about how people defend political ideas, right? There's a panic to it. It can be irrational. Some of the behavior borders on like fucking demon possession. Think about people screaming and crying in the streets. You see it and you know it's not normal, or at least not really rational. Even if you agree with them, you might think, well, that seems like a lot. And I know everyone is thinking of those other people. I mean, they're obviously the ones that didn't do the research, right? Not like you anyway. We all know that you're the one that really digs deep, examines the counterpoints fully. You take history into account, and then you make a decision based on rational thought and, most importantly, science, because you should trust the science. What we're talking about is the passionate desire to defend an individual that would step over your fucking body and the bodies of those you love most to get what they want. And it sucks. But look, at the end of the day, for rational people, it's not about the candidate. It's about what the candidate wants, the direction they want to steer the country. If it's the same as yours, more or less, you support them. And that makes sense. You care deeply, at least, about attempting to solve certain problems in the country. And that's why you voted the way you did. You care. That's not crazy. That's not irrational. And look, it's just my 2 cents, right? And I paid for this microphone. But if we don't expand English language to include more words than just male and female, if we don't expand our perception to allow male-bodied beings of all ages to compete in whatever sport they want, regardless of it being historically for these female-bodied beings only, if we don't allow children that aren't old enough to drink, get tattooed, vote, or drive a car to put the kibosh on the hormone production in their own bodies, then we are going to have a nuclear crisis on our hands greater than the Cold War. And if you don't think that those issues have a real bearing on inflation, our geopolitical standing, and the tax code, then you are fucking wrong, my friend. Now, that's just my humble opinion, but I do encourage you to consider it. Now, look, I know, you all know I hate to get political here. Like, I like to keep it light and just discuss things like meditation, sex, magic, and journaling. But this is just something it's been on my mind for a while. Anyway, think about how people become so emotionally invested in an ideology, not solving a crisis, but the ideology. In fact, the ideology will get in the way of solving the actual crisis, but they get so attached to that ideology that they refuse to acknowledge contradictions, misunderstandings, jokes, or even changing circumstances. Most people say the sky is brown simply because the guy they hate said it was blue. And it gets to that point because the ideology isn't just an idea anymore. It's an egregor. It's feeding off attention. It will influence the minds of its adherents to make sure that it stays front and center. And this is why certain political ideologies consume people. It becomes an entire personality for some. They become religious about these ideas. They even maintain outward expressions of their faith. It's a way to say, I'm not like you. And make no mistake, these expressions aren't worn to find like-minded people or to establish a community or togetherness, but instead are there to separate themselves from others. And I know you're all thinking of the highly inflammatory big red hat, but that's not what I'm thinking about. I'm actually thinking about the classic Be Kind t-shirt, or the Be Nice bumper sticker, or my personal favorite, the alternative to the stick figure family of guns plastered across the rear windshield of a pickup truck. These articles of faith are not displayed in an effort to find like-minded people. They're there to either wag their finger at other people in some sick virtue signal kind of way. I'm not like you. I'm nice. I'm really, really super kind, and don't you fucking forget it. Or to create fear in others to show them, hey, I'm not to be fucked with. I know I was a little fat kid once that got bullied, but now I'm a big man with wraparound sunglasses and a beard, so don't fuck with me. These people aren't worried about you being kind to other people. They're worried about you being kind to them. They aren't worried about your Second Amendment rights because they believe that you should have the right to self-defense. They are worried about theirs. And all of that makes sense, but just know that those things are displayed out of fear. And fear begets fear. They've stopped being individuals and started channeling the thought form or tulpa or egregor that they've aligned with. It creates a dangerous amount of groupthink. So how do we break free from the egregor's influence? Well, the first step is awareness. Once you understand that these collective thought form energy ghost entities exist, you can start to see when they're influencing you. And the second step is detachment. You don't have to reject every idea outright, but you should always ask questions. Is this belief mine, or am I just absorbing it? Do I believe it because I've personally witnessed it? Why do I think the way I do? Self-inquiry. Again, this is self-inquiry. These are scary questions for the mind. Remember, the mind believes that this reality is objective, stable, and unchanging. These sorts of questions could result in answers that leave us confused about what's real, or humiliated, or even embarrassed, or could cause us to have to change our framework for thinking. And that is terrifying to the mind, because that means we have to exile ourselves from the kingdom or go wander in the desert. At the end of the day, these egregores are only as powerful as the attention and energy we give them. Remember, energy flows where the attention goes. I love you, I love you, I love you. You reminded me once, so I'm going to remind you now. Thank you, thank you, thank you. If you enjoyed this content and would like to support its creation, visit theinfinitesparkofbeing.com. There you can explore the various ways to get involved and support this work. Click the About button, read a little bit about me, and see what I have to offer you through the one-on-one sessions. Don't forget to check out the Patreon tiers, where we're building a community of everyday people with not-so-everyday interests. You'll also find the online apparel store. And as always, head over to the Participate button and join us. Together, we're growing a community of spiritual seekers just like you.